they're taking they come into my house
Is it okay if or should I come in?
Wherever you need it. I need some help.
This is your piano, so go wherever you want.
Where you want to go?
Just a
Let
little
this
bit.
little man help you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is good. Just like I think I'll move my feet that way. And then I want to see if it's too loud if I open it. So you tell me.
I know it is. Wait.
Doyle,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Ben?
Oh, you had a tough one. Sorry about all that.
It is what it is, you know. You take care of me. Take care of you. That's the way it goes. They can all sit on the other side of the room.
I might just do half still.
It's fine. They can move because they're going to have to move anyway. I'll see you.
No worries. Okay, well, I guess I'm ready.
Yeah, we think it would be a good idea that all of y'all sit over there. Yeah.
But y'all really can't see at all.
Right.
This is emergency. Oh, that's my eyes for a minute.
Rest my eyes for a minute.
Sorry,
Let me just rest my eyes.
For a minute.
for a minute. I thought about you this morning. I thought,
I did.
Labor Day weekend. And I go over my brother and sister helped some, but they didn't help. They couldn't help a lot. And I mean, I went down there
And he's the one who had the idea. Two days.
Yeah, I'm a little tired.
Last January, I read that biography of Chopin that was recently published. I can't tell you. He's a white fellow.
Okay.
I was stunned. I took piano lessons for many years as a kid.
He loves all things music.
And when I was 12 years old, the music teacher gave me a free little bus for Christmas. And rock and Chopin. And someone got Chopin.
Yeah.
Store that I seen or walked by, and actually I bought one little thing there, but I always said I'm
I've
gonna
never
go shopping
really
one day when I'm
understood why Chopin was so significant. And reading this book opened my eyes to the manner in which he influenced composition. Everything came out. You know, tonal things that nobody had ever done. Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's stunning.
He was the first and foremost improviser.
Yeah.
Improviser.
Yeah.
Not like,
Yeah, he was like autistic people. I'll find the chair. Anyway, I'm sorry. No. I'm just. You have an
Hey, John. How you doing? Well, I had moved my chair over here, so
are you gonna be there?
It was a
You're
bad
gonna
place.
lose your.
Well, I always put my ear right up next to the speaker and cut it up really loud.
All right. Yeah.
I guess the intonation would be better somewhere else.
Whatever you want. Whatever you want. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, okay. I'm actually not late.
I think we're getting ready to start. This is Robert Buxton.
Hello.
He's a professor at UNC, teaches music there.
Yep.
And he today is going to talk to you about Chopin and play you some Chopin. Yes?
Yep.
And he has a 2-day-old.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me and ordering a piano. That's no easy feat, you know. You have to get this big thing, and it's not like guitar, you know, not portable. So, yeah, I teach piano at UNC, also privately, and I'm also music director at a church in Durham, St. Paul, and so busy. But the best thing I'm doing, thing I'm most proud of is our son now, 2 days old, Max, and but sleep deprivation is real. So forgive me if I don't know how I feel. A little nervous and very little sleep, but you know, coffee is a great thing. So yeah, I managed to smuggle a electric keyboard into the room because they kept us in the hospital for several nights. So I managed to get some work done. Interestingly enough, Chopin, as I walked in here, this is a sort of small room, and this is exactly the setting, the kind of setting that Chopin did his concerts in. Not in concert halls. He was rather shy, and he played in salons. This is like a salon, right? And that's what he would do. And he'd often improvise, and it was very informal, sort of like this. So also, please eat something. That was also part of the culture. It wasn't, you know, sit in an uncomfortable chair and listen. That's not how it was back then. It's nowadays. We ruined it. So, anyways.
Well, welcome to our salon.
Exactly. So, start with a personal experience. I went to Paris in 2007, and there was one day I had nothing to do, so I decided I'd go to the Père Lachaise cemetery. That's where many famous people are buried. Oscar Wilde, and I think even Jim Morrison is there. Yeah, exactly. So, and then Chopin was there. And I went to his grave, and at this time I was in high school, and I was actually sort of annoyed with Chopin's music. I thought it was overplayed. Every student, I went to the Manhattan School of Music in high school and in college. Every practice room you walked past, someone was playing Chopin. Sometimes not beautifully, sorry. But, sorry. But so I thought it was a bit of a cliche, you know, and I was interested in more experimental music, like modern music, lesser known composers. So I was sort of sick of Chopin. But I went to his grave, I was there, and I just sat there and I couldn't leave for like 2 hours. I don't know why. That's exactly how I felt toward his music. Always. That whatever is happening, I keep coming back to it. There's this magnetic pull. And I think ultimately, maybe the thesis of this lecture is, I can't really give you a lecture on Chopin. We can talk about his life, the music theory, even everything. But there's something, that essential thing can't be defined. It's just his intuition, his talent. I don't know. So, the next thing I want to speak about is to try to describe why I think his music, actually any music in general, can have this power, this effect on us, magical almost effect. That in the 18th century, we've sort of lost this now, but in the 18th century, the theorists and philosophers of music at that time, such as Rousseau, was a composer and a philosopher, they talked about music as rhetoric, or the art of persuasion. Music was rhetoric, and there are even rules of rhetoric, and I imagine lawyers study the art of persuasion in the courtroom. I mean, there are things you do, steps you can take, but again, like I was saying, a great speaker, a persuasive speaker, there's something you can't really put your finger on. It's something just, you can't define quite. So I want to, talk about Chopin's musical rhetoric, if you will call it that. And this is, again, it's just going to be my subjective attempt to explain what I think is going on, why his musical language, what it is, and why it moves us. So, the place to start is a little background on his life. Chopin was born in 1810, about 30-minute drive from, I'm thinking North Carolina, 29 miles or so from outside of Warsaw. I believe his father was French, actually. I was reading last night. I didn't realize that. I may be wrong, but that's what I saw. His mother was Polish. And the young Chopin was somewhat of a child prodigy. He even in some ways just found his style quite early on. His concertos, his 2 piano concertos, I played the first one. He wrote it when he was like a teenager. And it just came out naturally. Mozart was the same way. And this is, as a side note, why I actually have to admit, I actually struggle with Chopin's music because it's so pure. And, I'm a little bit more neurotic. I'm more comfortable with Schumann, who's a little bit more all over the place. But Chopin is tough because he's just, every note is just transparent. It's just like Mozart, same thing. So, at any rate, the big defining moment in Chopin's life, and I would argue what turned him from a very, very good composer to an extraordinary one, maybe, is that he was traveling outside of Poland around 1831 in what's now Germany, Saxony, and he got word that the November uprising had occurred in Warsaw. So what was that? The Russians were the Russian Empire was kind of occupying Poland at that time. And there was a group of, I guess, an insurrection of Polish people in Warsaw, and it was crushed by the Russians. As a result, the Tsar sent the Russian army there and turned Warsaw essentially into a prison. They closed the university. It was just like a war zone. They even, the descriptions of Warsaw burning at that time, it was just awful. And he realized, at the age of 21, Chopin realized he would never go home again, ever. So he tried to get a visa to go to London, perhaps. That didn't exactly work out. He ended up in Paris, of all places. And so nostalgia, or Poland, I would say, that's a defining characteristic of his music. This intense longing for his past, for home, the culture of his past, of his country, rather. So a great insight into that is a book by his friend and colleague, Franz Liszt. And Franz Liszt was born in 1811, just 1 year after Chopin. Liszt was from Hungary, which is also in Eastern Europe. And also Liszt ended up in Paris. They were friends and sort of rivals too. They actually both envied each other. Liszt envied Chopin's poeticism. And I'll talk about how he played. He didn't play in a showy manner. It was very intimate, very quiet. Liszt, on the other hand, muscular virtuoso, loud and fast. So, at any rate, Liszt wrote a book after Chopin's death at 39, very young. Liszt wrote a book about Chopin describing his character, what he even looked like. He was a very frail, small man. He had many physical ailments such as tuberculosis, possibly cystic fibrosis. Awful. Some days Chopin couldn't get out of bed in his later years. He was so sick. And even the way that he played, Liszt said that he would get into like a dream state. That's probably going to happen to me from sleep deprivation. But not, so he would get into this dream state while he was playing. And Chopin, by the way, was an improviser. They all were. We lost that in classical music today. Back then, improvisation was the main thing. In fact, and I'll explain more later, but Chopin would write one piece one way, and then he'd rewrite it 5 other ways, perhaps. He never played or even wrote the same piece out twice. Incredible. So it was improvisation. And I'm guessing, I'm pretty sure that when he played in public, he would ad-lib. Just, that's what they did. Not anymore. Now we have to be perfect. So, like I said about the no eating in the concerts, it's the same thing. Now we're all, too rigid. So anyway, I say bring back those things from the past. Liszt, the thing that really stuck with me from the Liszt book, actually many people say the Liszt book is, don't read it, it's not accurate history. He's not a historian, he's just writing a fairy tale. Well, guess what? Liszt was friends with him. So I think it's pretty good description. So Liszt talks about the culture of Poland, the folk music of Poland, which made a huge impression on the young Chopin. He went out to the countryside and saw people dancing the mazurka. I'll play a mazurka by Chopin. The mazurka is like the national dance of Poland, and in fact the national anthem of Poland is a mazurka. So Liszt describes in great detail even the dresses that the women were wearing with red and white cloth and how the dance looked, and it's just incredible. I recommend reading it. It's a free book on, you can download an ebook for free. So that's, I think, the folk music is such an integral part of Chopin's style. And how to make this relevant to today, because I don't think any of us were really there and know. So has anyone here seen the Ken Burns country music documentary? Yeah, all right. I think that's the closest thing. The images, the music, even the photographs, even the food that they would eat. I remember I went to the Ryman. I also like country music. I went to the Ryman and we took a tour with my dad. He was like crying all the time. Don't tell me. And they described the smell of fried chicken that filled the room. It was very interesting. But anyway, I'm digressing a lot because of sleep deprivation. But that documentary, that insight, that description of rural life, of folk music, that's what country music is, right? I think that, all those stories in that documentary, and I think that, if you can just imagine that type of thing, but in the context of 1820s Poland, I think that gets us as close as we can to Chopin. So, at any rate, I guess that's a decent summary of his life. He just stayed in Paris. He ended up, he had several relationships, famously with women, most famously George Sand, the novelist. There's even some corny movies about it. But the reality was his life in Paris was not so easy. He was very ill, and there was even one winter when George Sand brought Chopin to Majorca, an island in Atlantic, for healing, and they had no heating, and it was awful. He became even more sick, actually. It was really tragic. He wrote his second sonata with a funeral march in Majorca. So, really, his life was difficult. However, I'll tell you another story. I was in Paris at a music program with my teacher, And he brought us to this very, very upscale neighborhood of Paris. It's just rich like crazy. And he points to this apartment, said that was Chopin's apartment. And all the students, I thought he was this like sickly, starving artist. No, he taught a lot of lessons. And of course, this is my teacher. He teaches himself, so he had this little glimmer in his eye. So teaching is really good. He had so many students that he lived in this neighborhood. So I just thought that was interesting. But he suffered tremendously. So now I want to speak a little bit about how Chopin himself played the piano. Unfortunately, no recordings. That's a tragedy. You know, music notation doesn't really capture all that much. I mean, you write music out on the page. That's only, 50% of it, maybe less. So, of all the nuance, of a performance. But, although we don't have recordings, we have some descriptions of how he played. And, again, the main thing that characterized his playing is improvisation. He was always just ad-libbing. And I think it's also good to talk about the pianos of that time, of 1830s in Paris. Totally different instrument from this. The pianos of Mozart's and Haydn's time, a little earlier, late 1700s, keyboard was about this big. It was a much smaller thing. The keys themselves were smaller. Have you heard stories that Beethoven would break the pianos? That's because they were pretty flimsy. It's not really his fault. Poor guy, Beethoven. Actually, later Beethoven got a London-built Broadwood piano, which this is important. You see this metal in here? That's called a cast iron frame. And that allowed for a much more sonorous, loud, rich sound in the piano. And they were not being built in Vienna. Those pianos were being built in London and Paris. See, Chopin comes in here. As kind of part of this industrial revolution, this explosion of industry in Europe and also here at that time, early 1800s. And this change in the construction of the piano, they had more keys, there was a heavier touch, gave birth to the piano virtuoso. And the most famous of which is Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt, I don't know, I play you a little bit of his music. He was always, little quote from it, loud and big orchestral sound. So, because he could do it. You couldn't do it on the older pianos. The virtuosity thing was not always so wonderful. There was a guy, I don't mean to put him down, but there was a guy named Dreischock, Alfred Dreischock. They said he played so loud. He was in Paris at the time, too. He played so loud that if the wind was blowing the right way, you could hear him in Vienna. So, unfortunately, we don't play Dreischock anymore. I haven't heard much of his music, so I shouldn't judge. But that's what I've heard. And there were many others, Thalberg, and all this explosion of the virtuoso. The interesting thing is, and by the way, I played on a concert on a piano from that time, from the 1830s, 40s, built in Paris, the Erard pianos. It's still different from this instrument. It's still not quite as powerful as this thing. But big difference from Mozart's pianos in the 1790s or whatever, 80s. Interesting thing is, Chopin was a bit of an outcast for this. He rejected this virtuosity. He was, first of all, physically, he was too frail, and I can relate to that right now. But he was just too frail. He couldn't produce this huge sound. His favorite piano was a little bit of an older brand called the Pleyel, another French piano, similar to Mozart's piano, light touch. I have heard from people, I haven't played one, unfortunately, but heard from people, they said that if you do this to the keys, you just blow it, the keys will play. So, different instrument, different tone. So Chopin was kind of, retro. He was backward looking. He was not really in touch with the times. Because we had two different things going on in the 1830s, the early 19th century. You have this explosion of modernity and industry and progress. But then you also have the romanticism, of whom Chopin is one. What is romanticism? Kind of a rejection of all that. It's a return to nature almost. And my wife sort of jokes around that this is taken to a bit of an extreme by some residents of Carborough. Back to nature. I'm sorry, it's not, nothing wrong with that, but it's the same. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Going back to something natural, less, technologically. Today it continues. Right? Look what I'm reading from, right? So, and this Chopin was very much a part of this rejection of the virtuosi. So was Schumann, another colleague, contemporary of Chopin. They rejected this kind of loud playing. And the interesting thing about Liszt, back to Liszt, he started kind of as a virtuoso. Learning, he would practice for hours and hours, Liszt would practice for hours and hours a day while reading Dante, exercises to build his technique like an athlete. And so Liszt was one of the virtuosi. Then he meets Chopin, and he realized, I'm missing something poetic. He learned it from Chopin, I think. Don't quote me on that, but so another thing, talking about Chopin being interested in the past. That's, by the way, that's another romantic thing. You know how they say we romanticize the past? That's romanticism. Give you an example. In Bach's time, nobody was interested in the music of 20 years ago, 100 years ago. That was yesterday's, nobody cared. Handel wouldn't care about his opera from 2 seasons ago. It was old stuff. Go on to the next thing. It's only later, like in Chopin's time, that the composers start to care about older music. Johann Sebastian Bach, famous now, right? Nobody knew him after his death in 1750. Mendelssohn, who was born in 1809, right next to Chopin. Mendelssohn resurrected the Bach St. Matthew Passion. And Chopin had Bach's music always on his piano. And so Bach, the moody counterpoint, very flowery, almost a sound of the church music of Bach, lives in Chopin's music as well. I like to think it's Chopin's style is like a stew with all these different ingredients. Polish folk music, Bach, etc. So, I think that's pretty much it, I would say. Again, his manner of playing, he used very flat fingers, I've read, very soft touch, a lot of rubato, which means not playing in tempo, like a part. He didn't play like that. Some people say, like one of his students, his name is Mikuli, Karl Mikuli, said that Chopin played the left hand always in tempo, and the right hand out of tempo. That sounds strange. How does it? But the reality is, and I'll talk about it more with the first piece, which illustrates that. The reality is, a great singer will do that. The accompaniment will be almost like clockwork, but the singer will sing around off the beat, out of time. Frank Sinatra does it. Willie Nelson does it. I'll give you an example. So, Southern Gospel, it's written. That's not how Willie Nelson sings it, or Johnny Cash, or Mahalia Jackson, or what, There's the accompaniment, right? And then the voice up here. I'm off. Little improvisation. So, that's what he was doing, I think. I read another account which said, no, actually Chopin had no rhythm at all. So, and it's interesting, I think that our concept of time is different now. Everything's timed back then, and by the way, in some cultures even today, showing up at 9 a.m., which is a good thing I did, would be more like, I'll show up at 11 a.m. and that's on time. So what's time? And that was, I think, in the past. They weren't, checking the clock all the time. I read that it's a big diversion, sorry, but the modern idea of time and keeping time, like track of time, was because of the train schedules. You didn't need it if you were taking a horse somewhere, right? I mean, you could show up like today or next year or whatever. It's all good. So the timing in Chopin's music, I think, was much freer than we would expect. And I try to do that somewhat. However, he had a metronome, and he liked his metronome. But, there are all kinds of debates in the music world. It actually gets kind of annoying because it's like minutia, But, like Beethoven said, he said, the metronome marking I write, what a metronome is, like a clock, beat. The metronome marking I write only applies to the first few notes because Beethoven said the rest of the music's sensitivity has its own pulse. I think it's a great quote. When someone tells me, you got to play it like this, Beethoven said otherwise. So, okay, now to the playing, and good luck to you and me. I can talk still, but I don't know. So I'm going to start with a nocturne by Chopin. It's a famous piece. Actually, you may have heard it in this movie from a few years back, The Pianist. It's a pretty good movie. And this is the Nocturne in C sharp minor. And it's a very moody, typical Chopin piece, very emblematic of his style. And the Nocturne what is nocturnal? It's a night piece. Kind of not appropriate for today, but it's okay. Morning. Chopin based his nocturnes on the piano nocturnes of another composer, an Irish composer named John Field. Beautiful pieces, by the way. And so he takes those as a model for his composition. But I think the most important thing to talk about with the nocturnes is bel canto opera. What did Chopin do on the weekends when he had nothing to do? Did he go to the movies? Did he watch YouTube? No. Went to the opera. And the greatest opera composers of that time were Vincenzo Bellini and Donizetti. I can't speak Italian, but I can pretend. And that music, again, was characterized by, you would have the orchestra playing an accompaniment, and then the melody somewhere on top, the singer. Like that. And the nocturnes, it's like an operatic aria, but for the piano. No words, I'm not going to sing, thank goodness. But you can imagine, what it would be. And that's the thing, by the way, about listening to music, and I talked about rhetoric, and that, in those old days, they thought that musical ideas had very specific meanings. Let's try an exercise. What do you think of when you hear this? What do you... Yeah, what about, horn calls, French horns, hunting horn calls. But it could be anything. That's the thing. Because a lot of people ask me, I want to listen to music, but I don't know how to understand it. How do I understand it? There's bad news and good news. The bad news is, I got a doctorate in this, but I don't understand it. But I shared a story. I don't want to take too much. I talk a lot. Sorry. It's a Southern thing. So, half Southern, half Russian. So, there's a lot of talking going on. And my family's right nearby, whole family, and they all like to talk. So, sorry. But, wait, what were we talking about? Rhetoric and about the ideas. This story is that I was at a party when I was 14 with some of my mom's Russian painter friends. And there was a lot of vodka involved. Of course, I didn't have any, maybe a little bit, not really. And I was in the living room, and I was staring at this avant-garde experimental painting, like a Jackson Pollock thing, that was done by Anatoly, the host of the party. I was staring at it. And from behind me comes this guy named Grisha, Russian guy. He's like a big, fair guy. And now I realize he was probably quite tipsy. And he just comes to me and he puts his arm around my shoulder. He says, "It's beautiful, yes?" And I said, yeah. I was a little bit startled, what is this guy doing? And I said, but can you help me? I don't know, how do I understand this painting? I don't get it. And he just turned to me with this anger in his face. He grabbed my shoulders and he started shaking me. And he said, no. It's not about understanding. If you look and you feel something. That's it, I think. I mean, it boils down to that, I would say. So when you listen, don't try to understand, but whatever images and things come to your mind, like someone said, is dance, that's all good. That's how they listened to music back then. That's the rhetoric thing. That's the music, the ideas, melodies, and motivic ideas have meanings to them. So, anyway, yeah, well, I'll play the Nocturne, the first piece. Here we go. few more to go. Just kidding. So that's the nocturne. You can hear the opera, right? I mean, it just sounds like Italian opera. You hear the, Pavarotti singing something very tragic, something about love, maybe. And you know, this piece I forgot to mention. Chopin wrote it for his cousin, one of his cousins, or nieces rather. Sorry, who was learning his second piano concerto. And this piece actually quotes the second piano concerto. It has a lot of the themes of that piece. Beautiful piece, by the way. They're in there. So it's a little study, a little exercise piece for that the concerto. And other than opera, did you hear, I think, there's your Polish folk music here. It just it has that folk character. It could be country music from Kentucky. I mean, it has that that lilt to it. So, and then there are those moments that are just purely improvisational, like the end, where he floats somewhere. So, yeah, that's the nocturne. Get some water. And next, I'm going to go to a little more of an upbeat piece. It's pretty moody. As Chopin was a pretty moody guy. He wasn't like Mr. Haydn in Vienna. Haydn was bubbly and happy all the time. Chopin, not so much. You can hear it. The next is a waltz by Chopin. The waltz is a famous, everyone knows what a waltz is. It's a dance in three. And it was becoming popular at this time, especially. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can dance to it. Well, Chopin didn't write his waltzes to be danced to. I think he said that. I guess maybe someone tried to and he didn't like it. I wouldn't mind if you do. I don't care. But that's just, he said that somewhere. And the waltzes of Chopin, I think, are much more lighthearted. They're incredible pieces, beautiful. I remember hearing this waltz, the G-flat major waltz, when I was a kid, like 8 or 9 years old. No way I could have played it at that time, but it struck me. I don't know. I had this image of that I was transported to some, fancy salon somewhere, maybe with some flowers. I don't know. It was just very, very royal sounding, very beautiful. And I think that the waltz, it's definitely a salon piece. This is something he definitely would have played at one of those nice parties, kind of like this. This is not a party, but So it is. So it's a cheerful piece, yeah. And it's very aristocratic. It's very aristocratic, and there is that in his music. And I've heard some people. One pianist, Piotr Szewski, is a Polish pianist. I can't speak Polish; it's a tough language, but he said that Chopin's music is this incredible mix of sadness and joy, of very intense emotion, but great restraint at the same time. That's aristocratic, and there's some, I don't know, I was listening to an interview of William Faulkner, great Southern writer, and just the way he talks, it's aristocratic, he has this way of speaking. You can sense that there's great emotion under the surface, but he speaks very calm and gentle, so that, it's in here. So yeah, this is a little fun little piece, waltz by Chopin, G-flat major. so that, different mood, very bubbly. So yes, he did have a fun side. It wasn't all moody romantic stuff. So yeah. It almost reminds me, that piece almost reminds me of like a Charlie Chaplin movie. And Charlie Chaplin, of course, the silent films, there was always someone playing music on the piano, often improvised. And it's that old world thing. I know Chaplin was 20th century and Chopin was 19th, but again, someone told me that Charlie Chaplin will make you laugh and then he'll make you cry, both. So I think Chopin could be like that too. So next I'm going to play a mazurka. We talked about the mazurka, the national dance of Poland, and that the national anthem of Poland is a mazurka. And so the mazurka is very interesting. In some ways, perhaps, they're his best pieces, maybe, or his most personal. And I like to think of them as a musical diary. He put his own deep thoughts and frustrations and sadness and joy all in them. I mean, more so than maybe his other music. So, and the mazurkas are, of course, on the surface, they're the folk dance, the mazurka. On paper, a mazurka just looks like a waltz, a dance in 3. 1, 2, 3. But it's really not, because you're supposed to take a little time on the second beat, and third beat, it's really not a waltz. It's just totally different, and it changes more. The waltz is pretty, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? What I just played, the waltz. But the mazurka is these sudden, quirky shifts of character, just out of nowhere. And I think it makes it hard to play. For me, at least, I struggle. But so, and in some ways, it's also the most idiomatically Polish of his compositions, because it has that folk feeling. I read a quote about Chopin. Someone, I forgot who it was, said that, I think it was some Polish writer, they said that in Chopin's music, he dreams the past, present, and future of Poland. I think that's so interesting. And that's there. And that's what I was talking about, the Ken Burns documentary. It's the culture that's sort of gone, but it's sort of not. I mean, you can go out in the country somewhere and you can still experience that. The soul of the country. So that's the mazurkas, I think. So, anything else on the... Yeah, well, all right. Here's the mazurka in A minor. the nostalgia. Maybe you could feel it. You can almost taste it in there. I was thinking about this in the hospital after my wife gave birth. I didn't give birth. I didn't go through all of it, but I just lost a little sleep. That's all. And I thought, well, Chopin, he left his homeland and he never returned. Maybe I can't get that. Maybe not. And so the only place I left is I grew up in New Jersey. And it's not really, and I can go back there, so it's not quite the same. But I realize, it's in some sense we can all relate to that nostalgia, because home is not a place; it's a time. And I got kind of emotional at night. I couldn't sleep in the hospital, and I was thinking about my grandparents who are no longer here. I lost one in the summer. My grandma was very close to her, and how this is the past, and it was wonderful while I was there, but it's gone. And yet at the same time, in some sense, she lives on through great grandchildren now. So anyway, I think so the feeling of nostalgia, and nostos means home, longing for home, longing for the past. We are all like Chopin in that sense. So
It's a love song.
yeah, maybe. Is that how you heard it? Interesting. I'd like to, any more thoughts? Because this is the kind of thing you trust your intuition when you listen.
Well, it's obvious the guy was pretty enraptured with whatever he was writing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Fascinating. So, I think so. So the next piece is sort of I have maybe another short piece or so I can add, but depending on time. But the last piece I really want to play today is a larger work. Oof, I'm a little not, yeah. So, anyways, so I don't know. It's a very difficult piece. This is the Ballade number 4 by Chopin. It's a later piece of his. Late in his later years, he wrote it. It's longer, 13, 14 minutes. I don't know. It's long. And the ballades of Chopin, in some sense, what I wanted to do, I sort of had a plan here that I took these. He mostly wrote these short pieces, salon pieces. All three of what you heard, they were sort of salon pieces. And he mostly wrote this mazurkas, nocturnes, etudes, etc. This ballade, I think, it contains the styles of all of them. There's a mixture of them all. There's some waltz in there. There's some mazurka, a lot of mazurka in there. And it starts out very, very softly and just goes like the mazurka and just goes on and on and on. And then the thing about this piece is I get lost in it mentally. That's why I'm scared. Play it and no sleep. Before you know it, you're in this ocean of sound. It just develops not noticeable. Now, this piece, according to several people, I think it was Schumann and also Liszt, his friends, Chopin's friends, they said that this was based on a poem by the great Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz. And in this poem, it's set sort of in a mythical past, like the medieval past of Poland or something like it. It's fairy tale-like. There's a father with 3 sons, and they go off to war, I believe. And they don't come back. And the poem is the emotions of the father. See, I can starting to relate to that myself, personally, You wouldn't want your child to leave you for 1 second, but his children left. And I think the piece, it's his hopes and being crushed by reality. They're not coming back. And then finally, at the very end of this poem, the 3 sons return triumphantly on horseback. Unexpected. And the most obvious parallel to that is the parable of the prodigal son, returning home. And I was thinking about this poem and this piece, and I think it's a drawn out, dream, really, daydream, maybe, of Chopin returning home in his imagination, himself, the lost son of his country. So, there's a lot in this piece, and it's so good luck to you and good luck to me. I hate to be like this, but I have my, in case I have the sheet music, I don't want to use it, but it's just challenging, this emotionally too. So anything else about the ballade?
Where would he play this sort of piece?
This sort of piece? Interesting question. I think, so he didn't play very many public concerts at all. And he did some salon things, and I think some of the pieces he didn't even play much himself. His etudes, I might play one later if we have time. His etudes, the studies, they're very technically challenging. They're for students. For the students he had. He never played them. Liszt played them, and Chopin actually said he was envious that Liszt could play these pieces I wrote with these great fingers, but I don't. So the short answer is he may have not played this. Or he played it in the salon, or for friends. He'd often just play for friends at his apartment, his home. Yeah, I think so, because like we were saying, he was, the way he played was so subtle and so soft, and I get carried away, but he was much more restrained than I am. I failed to do what he, I think, wanted, but yeah. That's it. I was going to say something that escaped me. Yeah, hold on.
That's what happens when you have children.
Yeah, that's it. So, well, at any rate, that's what I was going to say. That by the end of the piece, remember how I said that Chopin influenced Liszt, the virtuosity? Well, at the end, I think you see Liszt influenced Chopin too. He wouldn't admit it. He was proud of that, but that virtuosity and the pianos of that time, it shows up at the end of this. It's a lot of fingers. That's why I'm nervous. So, okay. Ballade number 4, 1842 by Chopin.
Are you playing this from memory?
I'll try. Yeah. So, could do it if I slept. It's too many excuses. Okay, here we go. I didn't. Yeah, that's a trick. I didn't warn you about it. There's a false ending there. But that's they hadn't made it home. He thought he saw them in the distance, but no, it's really and that's it's another thing. He plays with expectations, and I think it's great that everyone thought it was over because it's over, but it's not. So I mean, it's wonderful. Well, I guess we can stop here if you have any questions about Chopin, but.
Thank you.
Well, if you, I can a little, but probably you'll get some free. But thank you so much, and this piano is nice. Thank you, Stephanie, for like I said, it's not easy to get a piano into places. So,
well, thank you for being here with your infant son.
okay.
I know you're at home, and I know you want to be there.
Well, I'll be there soon. I live in Mebane, close. So, but thank you. Yeah, I see some hands. Yes, sir.
I can't imagine that you would ever need instruction, but do you go to a teacher? Do you
That's a good.
get instruction? Do you practice with someone?
Right now, no. I got my doctorate and finished in 2018. So yeah, I worked very heavily with a Russian pianist named Vladimir Vyardo, wonderful pianist, great guy, a little crazy, but great, and got a lot from him. So, and that was until pretty recently. And then now, that's a good question. Not really. Of course, other musicians would have a lot of critique to say. My best teacher is my wife, so she's also a pianist, and she plays. She doesn't like teaching. I don't know why she's good. She'd be good at teaching. She likes accompanying. Her doctorate was in accompanying piano, so she plays with many choirs. And I'll be practicing at home. Sometimes I do the list method. I'll read if I'm doing just bland exercise. I'll read a book because I get bored. Watch baseball. Be practicing, and she'll come to me and say, that could have been a little better. She's my best teacher, and she knows, And also, actually, yeah, my family's around. So my mother, who's not a pianist at all, but she'll say, "Yeah, you did it better like a week ago." So, yeah, I get advice. Yeah.
So when did you start playing the piano?
Oh, that's a good question. So, okay, two answers. I started when I was like 3 or 4, but I wasn't really. All the teachers were like, "Oh, yeah, he's not really good. Maybe you should stop." And then I don't know. I caught the bug later. I just never stopped. I always liked music. I'd listen, but I couldn't really do much. And then it's crazy. I have some young students. I have some private students outside of UNC. Some of them are like good. And it's, wow, what did I miss? But around 13, 14, I started getting really just into it, and then that's when it became my life, really. So a little bit, sort of a late bloomer. But
Do you play any other instruments?
I did. It's funny. I wanted to play cello. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to say about Chopin. He's like one of the few composers who like only wrote for the piano. Mm-hmm. But he wrote his concertos. There's orchestra part, A lot of people say that his orchestration skills are pretty bad. I don't know if it's great music, but he just, one instrument that he loved other than piano was the cello. And he has a cello sonata for piano and cello. It's really a sonata for the piano with cello accompaniment. Because the cellists, I know, they always tell me, oh, that's a vacation piece for us. Okay, I wanted to be a cellist at one point, so I played cello in school badly. It's in New Jersey. I had a cheap rental cello from the school. I was walking on ice, and I saw a friend, and I waved. I slipped backwards, fell. I was fine, the cello was not. And that was the end of my cello. So that's it. Yeah, so I could have been here today playing. I wish, but yeah. Anyway.
Where did you go to school?
Okay, I went to Manhattan School of Music, high school. I went to public high school in New Jersey, weekends as the Manhattan School. With the same teacher, Solomon Mikovsky, I did another 4 years in college, and then went to University of North Texas. Very big music school, that, you know, in the middle of nowhere in Texas, but great music school. And I went to work with this Russian pianist, Viardo. So unfortunately, I play in a very Russian way. My mom's also from Russia, so Chopin might not be too thrilled with that because the Russians, you know, but that whatever. Yeah.
How long have you been at UNC?
Since 2017, when we moved. My wife, we drove our cats from Texas to here. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. You were
oh, thank
awesome.
you. Thanks for having me.
Maybe you have one more little piece in
What?
little one.
Maybe later, if I might. Get
You
some-
want something to drink, like some caffeine?
Yeah, maybe that would be good.
Or
Coffee.
a Coke or coffee?
Oh, coffee. Just
Coffee.
plain coffee, like take it straight.
What is
Yeah.
your favorite Chopin?
You know what? I think it might be the fourth ballade. And there's one pianist, John Ogden, the British pianist, he said, it's relatively short, 12, 13, 14 minutes, depending on how fast you play it. But it's so like a Beethoven symphony would be 30, could be 30 minutes or more, whatever. Mahler could be more than that. But this pianist said that that piece has the experience of a lifetime in it. It seems so long. That's the crazy. Oh, thank you. Oh, I'll just take the coffee. I don't need any milk. Yeah.
Okay.
Straight caffeine. So they want me to play a
What
little
would you
more.
play for Max?
What would I play for Max? Not the fourth ballade. I'd play maybe waltz, maybe. You know, something light and nice. Do you want to hear another Chopin, or do you want to hear?
Whatever you want to play.
Okay. I do have this etude of Chopin, which I don't know if my fingers can work, but it's interesting. I was thinking about doing it, but not, and then I guess if you want to hear it, I'll do it. So the etudes by Chopin are studies. Etude means study in French. So he wrote them for his students, presumably to develop finger technique, but I don't really think so, because I think there's more to it. The etudes, like Clementi, Czerny, you know those people, they wrote these exercises to ruin the lives of young students. Hanon, so I think what Chopin did is he took that format of an exercise and he turned it into a work of art, each piece. So I think there's studies in expression, not in technique. And this is the last one. It's the C minor. Some people call it the Ocean Etude. By the way, those names, like the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, he didn't call it that. That was the editors as a marketing technique. So, but it's nice. It sounds like moonlight, you know. This is an Ocean Etude. I struggle with it sometimes. And I think actually at the root of it, I think it's a cello piece, because the melody is, I'm not going to spill this on the piano, that would be tragic. But the melody, there's all this crazy stuff going on up here, but the melody is, that's cello range. So it's probably a cello piece. And the reason this actually connects to the ballade, because there's actually one place in the ballade where Chopin directly quotes this piece. coffee. Oh, yeah, I got it. I'll take a little more. Yeah. Caffeine's great. I didn't have it for 2 days at the hospital, and I thought I was going to throw up, and I remembered, so gotta drink coffee. So, in the ballad, and there's this part towards the end, I don't know if you remember, where it goes... Those arpeggios going up and down? That's that piece. The whole Ocean Etude is that. And he quoted it. So he plagiarized himself. Here we go.
Max. Oh, you are awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, plenty of coffee.
Thank you so much for having me and listening to me rant and play. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming.
We can stay all day.
I might need to stay a little to get some caffeination.
10-minute break, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was just fabulous. You were here to do this for us at this time so long. I look forward to seeing you with that career. Do we know what we're doing next?
Here, I got Thank you.
everybody was leaving the hotel, and we go out of our room.
Now that might do it, yeah.
Thank you. I think that's just a little safer than having what if an earthquake comes? You never know. I know. You can do that. Every day. We're having wonderful music, and I'm not going to do any music at all. We're going to think about what is the meaning of a life, successful life. I don't have the answer to this. Well, that's what I'm hoping for. I get your attention, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages.
You need a whistle for you?
Whistle for me. We've got miles to go before we sleep and miles to go before we sleep. I spent quite some time searching for people to elucidate and entertain you this morning. And a close friend of mine a year ago said, I've got just the person for this group. His name is Lloyd Kramer. He's a professor of European history at the college a couple miles from here, up on top of the hill. And he is director of Carolina Public Humanities, and he will tell you what that's about. But Dr. Kramer, I met with him at the art museum